9 symphonies, 32 piano sonatas, 16 string quartets. On the 7th of May, 1824, the man who wrote them stood on a Vienna stage with his back to the largest audience of his life, beating time to a symphony he could not hear a single note of. When it ended, the hall erupted, 5 waves of applause, hats and handkerchiefs thrown in the air because he could not hear the clapping. He kept conducting the empty air. One of the singers walked over, took him by the sleeve, and physically turned him around so he could see what he had done. Ludwig van Beethoven had been going deaf for 26 years, and he had just written the most famous piece of music on earth. This is how he did it and what it cost. He was born in Bonn in 1770, into a family that had already decided what he was for. His father, Johann, was a court singer, a heavy drinker, and a man who had noticed that a small boy called Mozart was making his own father rich. So Johann set out to manufacture a prodigy. There are accounts of the child being woken at night to practice, of being beaten at the keyboard, of tears. When Ludwig was 7, his father advertised his first public concert and shaved a year off his age to make the feat more impressive. Beethoven grew up genuinely unsure how old he was. Then, at 16, his mother died of tuberculosis, and his father's drinking finished what grief started. At 18, Ludwig went to the court and had half of his father's salary legally redirected to himself, so that he could feed his 2 younger brothers. He was the head of a household before he was a man, and he had one asset: he could already play better than almost anyone alive. In 1792, at 21, he moved to Vienna, the capital of European music, with a note from a patron telling him he would receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands. Mozart had died the year before. Haydn, the most famous living composer, took him as a student, and they did not get on. Haydn found him difficult, and Beethoven suspected Haydn of not reading his work properly. But Vienna took him instantly, not as a composer, as a weapon. He was the greatest improviser anyone had heard. Aristocrats staged piano duels in their drawing rooms, and Beethoven demolished the competition so thoroughly that one rival reportedly refused ever to play in the same room again. And here is the important part: he did not behave like a servant. Composers of that era wore livery and ate with the staff. Beethoven took the patronage and none of the deference, and the nobility, fascinated, let him do it. He was building a new job description while he was still learning the old one. Somewhere around 26, at the exact moment his career caught fire, he began to notice a humming and buzzing in his ears. Then he could not hear the flutes in the orchestra. Then he could not hear a shepherd singing in a field when the friend standing beside him could. Consider what this actually meant. His living came from performing. His entire identity, socially, was the man at the piano, and the one sense his life depended on was disappearing in his 20s from a cause no doctor of the era could name or treat. He hid it. For years he avoided company rather than admit it, and let people think he was rude, absent-minded, misanthropic, because being thought unpleasant was survivable and being thought deaf was not. He wrote to a friend, "I must confess that I lead a miserable life. For almost 2 years, I have ceased to attend any social functions, just because I find it impossible to say to people, I am deaf." In the autumn of 1802, his doctor sent him to Heiligenstadt, a quiet village outside Vienna, to rest his hearing. It did not work, and there, at 31, he sat down and wrote a document addressed to his 2 brothers that he never sent, the Heiligenstadt Testament. It is one of the most extraordinary things any artist has left behind. He tells them the truth about his deafness. He apologizes for how he has behaved. He describes standing beside a friend who could hear a distant flute while he heard nothing, and says the humiliation nearly finished him. And then, in the middle of what is effectively a suicide note, the document turns. He writes that it was his art, and only his art, that held him back, that it seemed impossible to leave the world before he had produced all that he felt called upon to produce. He put the paper in a drawer. It was found after his death, 25 years later. He had made a decision in that room. The hearing was gone, the work was not, and from that point he stopped defending the life he had and started building a different one. What follows is one of the great runs in the history of art. In the decade after the Testament, he wrote the Third Symphony, the Eroica, which is twice the length of a normal symphony of the day, and opens with two chords that sound like a door being kicked in. He wrote the Fifth, whose four-note opening is now the most recognizable phrase in Western music. He wrote the Pastoral, the Emperor Concerto, the Appassionata, his only opera. Music before him was largely built to please a patron in a room. Beethoven made it argue. A symphony became a story with a struggle in the middle and something earned at the end. And every composer for the next century wrote in the shape he left behind. He composed the Eroica for Napoleon, then, on hearing that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, tore the title page in half. The man who had refused to bow to Viennese princes was not about to celebrate a new one. All of this was written while his hearing was continuing to fail. By his late 40s, he was functionally deaf. From 1818, visitors had to write to him. They carried notebooks, wrote their side of the conversation, and he answered aloud. About 139 of those conversation books survive, and they are an eavesdropper's dream, half of every conversation in Beethoven's life, in other people's handwriting. To feel the piano at all, he used an auditory rod, a wooden bar pressed against the soundboard and gripped in his teeth, so the vibration reached him through the bones of his skull. He wrecked instruments trying to hear them, hammering until strings broke. And in that silence, he wrote the late quartets, the Missa Solemnis, and the Ninth Symphony, music so far ahead of the room that players complained it was unplayable, and audiences needed a generation to catch up. He was not composing from memory of sound. He was composing from a model of music he carried entirely in his head, and it kept getting better after the ears stopped reporting. The Ninth Symphony ends by doing something no symphony had done. It stops being an orchestra and starts singing, a choir, on a poem about all people becoming brothers. A man who had spent 26 years shut out of human sound wrote the greatest piece of music ever composed about human togetherness. 3 years later, he was dead at 56, and an estimated 20,000 people filled the streets of Vienna for the funeral of a composer. So what did he know? First, when the tool breaks, change the job. He could not keep being the greatest pianist in Europe, so he became the greatest composer. The same talent, rerouted through the one-channel deafness, could not close. Second, the work is what argues with the despair. He wrote the case for ending it and the case against it on the same page, and the case against was simply that the music was not finished. And third, he did not wait for permission. He took the money and refused the livery, and every artist since who has been treated as a maker rather than a servant is living in the room he kicked open. Next time, a man who spent 18 months on a farm because a plague closed his university and used them to invent calculus, take light apart, and work out why the moon does not fall. Isaac Newton, what he knew.